The first time Commander Halric Vance said it, he was half-conscious, bleeding out on the floor of a scorched command deck, and missing 2 fingers. The Jarnathi Admiral who heard it didn't live long enough to understand what the words meant. The second time, Halric was standing, barely, wrapped in a temporary exosplint and leaning against a bulkhead with his ribs taped so tight he couldn't sneeze without blacking out. "You thought that was my best." No admiral underestimated a human after that. It started 3 weeks before the Battle of Cerny's Gate, in a diplomatic escort mission that was supposed to be so dull. Halric had planned to catch up on sleep and finally finish reading the backlog of mission reports piling on his tablet. The mission was simple: escort envoy Dariana Syl from the Terran Coalition to the Neutral Accord Summit on Threxel Station. 100 ships from a dozen species were converging there for peace talks, and humans were invited to observe for once, not as a threat, but as witnesses. Halric didn't like politics. He liked orders, logistics, and the cold steel logic of battle planning, but Dariana had insisted. "You're not just muscle," she said in the shuttle hangar, adjusting the collar of her diplomatic robes. "You're good at reading people." "I need you there." "I'm good at reading enemy formations," Halric muttered, but she had already walked past him, heels clicking on the grated floor. The journey to Threxel was uneventful until the final leg through the Kelvish Drift. That's where the Zhurkaren fleet intercepted them 40 ships, twice the size of Halric's escort, and packed with enough firepower to level a city in seconds. Admiral Rishkull of the Zhurkarans hailed them directly. "Terran vessel, you are in restricted space. Power down and prepare to be boarded." Halric stood in the command center of the TCS Marlin, arms crossed. This region was declared neutral by the Accord. We're en route to an official summit. Rishkull's 3 eyes blinked out of sync. "Then you will not object to inspection. Power down." Now, Dariana leaned in behind Halric. "Let them board. We have nothing to hide." "There's a difference between hiding and letting someone dig through your life support systems for security checks," Halric said. He didn't power down. Instead, he rerouted power from the forward shields to the engines and sent a tight beam message to the other Terran escort ships. "Hold formation. Prepare for evasive maneuvers." Rishkull wasn't bluffing. The Zhurkarans opened fire. Halric's fleet responded, but they were outgunned. 3 ships were crippled in the first volley. The Marlin took a direct hit to the aft engines, sending it into a spin. Halric was thrown against the side console. Pain exploded in his shoulder. He rolled, came up bleeding from a cut above his eye, and barked, "Stabilize rotation." "Divert life support power to shields." A junior officer hesitated. "Sir, that will do it." Dariana gripped a stanchion to keep upright. "Halric, are you trying to get us all killed?" "I'm trying to make them waste every shot they've got." He tapped into the comms. "All ships, scatter pattern Delta. Target their weapon arrays only. Disable, don't destroy." The battle lasted 11 minutes. By the end of it, 2 Zhurkaran destroyers were adrift, one of Halric's cruisers was venting atmosphere, and the Marlin had lost artificial gravity and half its weapons. Rishkull hailed them again, blood oozing from a gash across his scaled forehead. "You fight well, human, but you've lost." Halric, his right arm hanging uselessly at his side, grinned through blood-streaked teeth. "You thought that was my best." Then he remotely triggered the thruster overload in the wreck of the TCS Shepherd, sending out a focused EMP pulse that fried every remaining Zhurkaran targeting system within 2,000 kilometers. The Zhurkarans withdrew. It took 4 days to limp to Threxel Station. Halric spent most of that time in the medbay, arm in a sling, ribs cracked, and left eye bruised shut. The medic, a quiet man named Patel, took one look at the readings and said, "You're not going anywhere until we scan your shoulder." The scan confirmed a dislocated joint and 2 fractured ribs. Halric endured the shoulder reset without anesthetics. There wasn't enough to spare and passed out immediately after. When he woke, Dariana was sitting beside his bed, arms folded. "You're out of your mind," she said. "Did we make it?" "Barely." He tried to sit up and failed. "Then it was worth it." At the summit, the Zhurkarans filed a formal grievance. The Accord dismissed it. The footage from the battle leaked, of course circulated through the inner colonies within days. That was the first time. The second was worse. 2 weeks later, Halric was assigned to a joint patrol mission with the Printari Empire. The Printari were known for their rigid hierarchy and disdain for improvisation. Admiral Kethan, a towering, insectoid commander with a voice like grinding gravel, led the fleet. Halric's orders were simple: observe, support, and not interfere. The mission took them to the edge of the Vayari Expanse, a region filled with electromagnetic storms, debris fields, and the remains of long-dead mining colonies. It was supposed to be a routine sweep. It wasn't. Midway through the sweep, the fleet was ambushed by raiders using cloaked ships' unknown tech, fast and erratic. Within minutes, 2 Printari cruisers were destroyed, and panic spread through the formation. Halric's ship, the TCS Valiant, took cover behind an asteroid cluster. He patched into the Printari command channel. "Admiral Kethan, your formation is collapsing. You need to regroup." "Hold your position, Terran. This is not your command." Halric clenched his jaw. "You're being flanked. Pull back or you'll lose your core defense ships." Kethan ignored him. Halric shut off the channel. "Lieutenant, open a secure line to all Terran vessels. We're moving to intercept the rear flank." The move was reckless. It exposed them to direct fire, and within seconds, the Valiant took 3 hits. One exploded near engineering, sending shrapnel through the rear bulkhead. Halric was thrown again, this time into the reinforced rail by the tactical station. His leg twisted under him with a sickening crack. Pain roared through him. He couldn't stand. "Status: Shields at 40. Engineering reports a hull breach. We've got fires on Deck 5. Halric gritted his teeth. "Launch drones. Feed false telemetry into their targeting systems. I want them chasing phantoms." The tactic worked. The raiders split, confused by the decoys. Halric's fleet capitalized, launching a coordinated counterattack that crippled one of the enemy ships and drove the others into retreat. When it was over, Halric passed out from blood loss. His leg was broken in 2 places. The medics stabilized him on site, but he needed surgery. He spent 3 weeks in recovery, real recovery, with rods and screws and painkillers that didn't always work. Kethan visited once, silent and towering at the foot of the medbay bed. "You disobeyed orders," he said. "I saved your fleet," Halric replied, voice dry. Kethan studied him for a long moment. "You humans are reckless." Halric didn't answer. Kethan turned to leave, then paused. "One of my officers said you broadcast a message during the battle. I did not hear it." Halric closed his eyes, felt the ache in every bone. "You thought that was my best," he whispered. Kethan left without a word. A month passed before Halric was cleared for duty. He walked with a brace, moved slower, and slept less. The nightmares had started: silent decks, ships tearing open, the crushing pressure of vacuum. He didn't talk about them. Most officers didn't. Then came the final mission. A rogue AI warfleet had gone silent for years, presumed dismantled or lost in the outer fringe. But it resurfaced near the border of the Jarnathi Protectorate, and it wasn't just active. It was growing. The Accord called for a joint strike force. Halric was tapped as tactical command advisor. He wasn't supposed to be on the front lines. He went anyway. The fleet assembled 80 ships, 12 species, each with their own command structure and protocols. Halric was the only human in the command chamber aboard the lead vessel, the Jarnathi Honor. Admiral Trevash, a skeletal alien with translucent skin, eyed him. "You are the strategist who survived the Zhurkaran ambush," Halric nodded. "And defied the Printari." "Also true. You will coordinate the outer flank. Should your forces fall behind, we will not delay for them." Halric looked him dead in the eye. "We won't fall behind." The battle was chaos. The AI ships fought without fear, without hesitation, adapting faster than any biological mind. The outer flank broke within the first hour, and Halric's sector was overwhelmed. He rerouted ships, sacrificed 2 to save 10, and kept the formation alive. The command ship was hit hard. Fires broke out. Halric was thrown across the bridge, his forearm snapping against the edge of a console. He bit through his lip and kept issuing orders. By the end, the AI fleet was in retreat, but the cost was high. 23 ships lost, thousands dead. Halric, barely conscious, was dragged from the wreckage of the Honor. His left arm was shattered, his ribs cracked again, and he had a concussion that left him drifting in and out for days. When he woke, Trevash was there. You survived, the Admiral said, not comfortably. Trevash hesitated. Before the final push, you said something to the fleet. Your translator did not render it correctly. Halric turned his head, eyes clouded. You thought that was my best, he said. Trevash bowed his head. No admiral will underestimate a human who says that again. The surgical lights cast a bluish glare that made everything look colder than it already was. Don't move, the surgeon said, her gloved hands coated with a reddish antiseptic that smelled like melted plastic and ammonia. You're still under partial nerve block. If you twitch, I might carve through a tendon I'm trying to save. Halric stared at the ceiling and exhaled slowly through his nose. His left arm was strapped open like a metal blueprint, bone exposed, muscle retracted. The brace holding it up hissed as the auto-stabilizer adjusted for the tremor in his shoulder. How long's this gonna take? That depends on how many more surprises your anatomy has for me, said Dr. Ilith, a Harkari with 6 fingers and a bedside manner that ranged somewhere between curt and hostile. Your elbow is a disaster. Who let you swing a plasma rifle with this kind of fracture? I wasn't exactly consulting a physician mid-combat. Shocking. The restraint buzzed softly as she adjusted the tension. Halric felt pressure, no pain, but the sound of tools clicking metal against bone made his stomach lurch. He focused on counting the ceiling tiles above him. He made it to 47 before Ilith snapped. Don't hold your breath. You'll pass out. Wasn't planning to. Just trying not to imagine what that sound was. That sound was me reattaching a ligament you nearly converted into soup. Halric shifted his gaze to the far wall and tried to ignore the hum of the bone saw. Somewhere down the hall, something exploded. The vibration rattled the overhead lights slightly. Ilith didn't look up. We're not being boarded. That was the reactor coolant line purging. Again, you're on a Jarnathi retrofitted cruiser. If it isn't exploding, it's asleep. 17 minutes later, she finally stepped back, peeled off her gloves, and muttered something in Harkari that didn't sound complimentary. You'll regain full range in 6 weeks. Or 4, if you listen for once and stop doing whatever it is you do to keep ending up on my table. Appreciate the craftsmanship. You should appreciate your mortality more. They moved him back to the recovery bay, a narrow chamber with too few beds and too many beeping monitors. A Printari nurse hovered nearby, clicking softly as he adjusted the infusion lines. Halric's new cast was a gleaming exo sleeve with embedded stimulants that would gradually rebuild the shredded muscle. It itched already. As the nurse stepped away, the door swished open and a figure ducked in under the too low frame. Captain Vral of the Catharan border guard folded his arms, antennae twitching in the recycled air. You look less dead than expected. You're disappointed. I'm curious. You were supposed to advise. Instead, you fought like your rank depended on dying dramatically. Halric raised an eyebrow. I thought you Catharans respected valor. Valor, yes. Masochism, no. Vral paced once around the bed, then stopped at the foot and leaned in, mandibles flexing slightly. The Fleet Council wants an explanation. You disobeyed coordinated withdrawal orders. You sacrificed a support frigate to shield a civilian transport. And you detonated a corvette's reactor core without clearance. They were about to be overrun. You made that gamble with 1,400 lives, and saved over 2,000. Vral tilted his head, considering. You didn't know the numbers when you made that call. No, Halric admitted. But I knew the stakes. Vral let out a low, clicking hiss that might have been exasperation. My people think you're reckless. Most people do. They also think you've earned a commendation. I'll settle for a working coffee dispenser and a room that doesn't smell like coolant, Vral straightened. I'll see what I can do. He was halfway to the door when Halric called after him. They thought that was my best. Vral paused, shoulders rising in a slow twitch. They're still recalibrating their definition. 4 days later, Halric was walking again, sort of. The brace kept his arm locked at a gentle angle, and his limp made stares an unpleasant joke. But he could stand. And with the help of a cane borrowed from a retired diplomat, he could navigate the ship's narrow corridors without falling over more than once an hour. The Marlin, rebuilt from the inside out, was docked at Relay Outpost 9A. a skeletal ring station orbiting a dead moon in the bleeding verge. The name had nothing to do with blood, and everything to do with how the local radiation made sensor readings scream nonsense every 30 minutes. He was on his way to the primary observation chamber, where the leadership council of the Joint Expeditionary Fleet had gathered for a debrief. The last time he'd been in a room with this many admirals, it had ended with a court-martial threat and 3 hours of translation errors. This time, it started with silence. Admiral Trevash stood closest to the viewport, arms clasped behind his back. The others, Vral, Kethan, 2 Tarskan envoys, and a silent observer from the Rillan assembly watched Halric as he entered. No one offered a seat. He didn't ask for one. "If this is about protocol," he said, Kane tapping once as he stopped in the center, "I can save everyone some time. I didn't follow it." Kethan's compound eyes shifted. The loss of the Drallan was unnecessary. "It was deliberate," Halric replied. "Their core was unstable. If I'd let them limp away, they would have detonated inside the evac corridor. The data doesn't confirm that," said one of the Tarskans, his voice a deep, wet gurgle. "I wasn't waiting for confirmation. I was watching their coolant pressure spike. You guessed." Halric's fingers tightened on the cane. "I read the pattern. I've seen that failure before. On a Terran moon where the reactor shielding was thinner than a soup can, I made the call." Trevash turned, his translucent face unreadable. "The outcome favors your decision. The reasoning remains questionable. Then ask me if I'd do it again." No one spoke. Halric let the silence stretch. "What exactly do you want from me?" Vral's antennae flicked. "We want to know what you're trying to prove." "I'm not trying anything," Halric said. "But every time I've stood in a room like this, there's been a quiet assumption that humans are volatile, unreliable, too independent." He rested both hands on the cane. "Maybe that's true. But when your formation is collapsing and your comms are dead, you'll want someone who doesn't freeze waiting for permission." The Rillan observer finally spoke, voice soft and metallic. "Your injuries are significant. Why didn't you withdraw?" "Because I wasn't done." Trevash stepped forward. "You said something at the end of the battle, a phrase. It has become discussed." Halric met his gaze. "You thought that was my best." Trevash inclined his head. "What does it mean?" "It means we don't stop when the odds say we should. It means if you think we're beaten, you're not seeing the whole picture." Kethan's mandibles clicked once. "A threat, a promise." There was no applause, no nods, just the quiet buzz of the room's air recyclers and the distant thrum of a station too old to be graceful. "You'll be assigned to the next conflict theater," Trevash said eventually. "The Charnathi incursion on the Outer Rim." Halric arched a brow. "That's not an advisory role." "No," Trevash agreed. "It isn't." The meeting dissolved. One by one, the officers exited, leaving Halric alone by the viewport. Outside, the stars drifted past in slow arcs, and somewhere beyond them, another war waited with unfamiliar ships and unfamiliar rules. He tapped the cane once on the floor. It made a dull, final sound. Then he turned and walked out. The Charnathi incursion had already carved a black line through 3 sectors by the time Halric arrived at the forward operations post on Drelva Point. The base was less a fortress and more a stitched-together patch of prefabs and auxiliary hulls, built hastily atop a jagged plateau that trembled every time the orbital cannons fired. Everything smelled like scorched lubricant and ozone, and the wind never stopped howling through the broken valleys below. He stepped off the transport shuttle with a fresh brace around his arm, his cane swapped for a reinforced stabilizer boot that clicked with every step. A pair of Korvathi gunners stared at him as he limped past. One leaned over and muttered something Halric didn't catch, but the other replied in a low, rattling tone that made them both fall silent. He didn't ask. Let them guess. The briefing dome was a squat cylinder surrounded by thermal shielding and a dozen antennae pointing in every direction like confused insect legs. Inside, the air was thick with heat and static. Tactical maps blinked across a central helipad, red sectors pulsing steadily, entire regions crossed out in angry yellow arcs. A Zalari officer, skin a dull shade of violet and eyes like polished resin, turned as Halric entered. "You're the human." "Unfortunately," Halric said, lowering himself into a seat with a hiss of effort. What's the situation? The Zalari didn't sit. We've lost outer perimeter support. The Charnathi have phased artillery. They bypassed half our mines as if they weren't there. They've taken the eastern ridge and they're building static towers. If they finish, we lose orbital uplink and our exo-atmospheric coverage goes dark. Halric studied the map. What's stopping us from hitting them now? The towers emit localized gravitic disturbances. They bend trajectory paths. We can't even get a solid mark. Then we get boots on the ridge. There's no approach left that's not a death funnel. Halric leaned forward, tapping a blinking sector. What's this? Collapsed infrastructure. Fault zone, unstable terrain. He looked up. Has it been tried? The Zalari gave a clicking laugh. We're not suicidal. Not yet. He requested an immediate recon drone to be sent through the fault zone. The operator hesitated until Halric reminded him, without raising his voice, that losing the uplink would invite a bombardment no shield net could absorb. The drone launched within the minute. It took 23 minutes to traverse the chasm. The footage was ugly. Jagged stone, magnetized debris fields, and unstable platforms that cracked under the drone's weight, but it made it through. We can get a small team in, Halric said. 5 at most, enough to disable their generators. The room didn't nod or murmur, it just stared. A Naren engineer finally said, "That's a suicide run. Not if we move fast and carry our own dampeners." "You're still recovering," the Zalari said. "You can't lead this." Halric stood. "I'm not asking permission." They deployed at first light. Halric led the team himself. 2 Korvathi infantry with shock pikes, a Tarskan sapper whose vocabulary was limited to monosyllabic threats, and a soft-spoken Rillancom specialist who'd never seen live combat. Their drop was quiet. The fault zone was as bad as the feed had shown, with gravity shifts causing them to stumble every 20 meters, and the air so dense with ionized dust that the respirators clogged twice before the halfway point. At one crossing, Halric slipped on a narrow ridge. His stabilizer boot caught, but the jolt sent a shooting pain through his hip that made his vision flash. He didn't say anything. The Tarskan grunted and hauled him up with one arm. Midway through the climb, the Korvathi scout ahead signaled a halt. They crouched beneath a ledge of fractured basalt while a Charnathi patrol passed above, their armor humming with low-frequency pulses. One of the Korvathi began to twitch, the sensors in his pike reacting to the distortion. Halric reached over, twisted the emitter off manually, and held it until the patrol moved on. At the top of the ridge, the tower loomed. It wasn't elegant. Charnathi design never was. It pulsed with uneven blue light, its base surrounded by a shifting field of distortion that made the ground ripple like boiling tar. The sapper reached into his pack and pulled out a trio of shaped charges, each one designed to detonate with a triple-phase collapse. Halric pointed to 3 support pylons, set them in sequence. "We'll trigger them remotely after we fall back." The sapper nodded and vanished into the haze. 10 minutes passed, then the tower's hum changed pitch. "He's been spotted," the Rillan whispered. The base swarmed with movement. Charnathi troops poured out from camouflaged bunkers, their rifles arcing with blue fire. The sapper bolted from the pylon, one charge short, and dove behind a rock outcrop. Halric didn't wait. He stood, took the launcher from his back, and fired into the side of the tower. It didn't breach the field, but it drew every eye. "Fall back," he called. They ran. The ridge behind them fractured with each step. The sapper limped, trailing smoke. Halric grabbed his other arm in half, dragged him across the last platform. Behind them, the tower's field sparked violently. They reached the lower basin just as the charges detonated. The sound was delayed by a full second. A deep, concussive thud that rolled down the mountainside in waves. The tower folded in on itself, the distortion field collapsing like glass under pressure. Charnathi screams echoed distantly as the ridge crumbled beneath their position. The team waited in silence, breathing hard. The Rillan's hands trembled. One of the Korvathi sat down and removed his helmet, face soaked in sweat. Halric leaned against a rock, his brace spattered with dust, and stared at the burning wreckage above. "Next time," he said, "someone else leads the hike." They returned to the outpost at dusk, The comms specialist was immediately swept into debrief. The Korvathi were taken to the medtent for burns. The Tarskin refused treatment and sat outside drinking something thick and yellow from a metal flask. Halric, limping worse than before, made it to the infirmary alone. The medic on duty, a thin Brelan with unfocused pupils, tried to steer him toward a cot. Halric waved him off. Just scan the hip. It's either dislocated or cracked clean through. The scan showed both. You should be unconscious, the medic said, visibly unnerved. Already did that last month. They fitted him with a suspension harness and injected a stabilizing agent that numbed everything below the waist. The resetting of the joint required 2 assistants and a manual crank. Halric didn't scream, but the metal bar he gripped bent visibly. By nightfall, the ridge was secure. The Charnathi had pulled back, the uplink reconnected. Orbitals fired through the breach and took out the static arrays. The regional command center updated the map. The eastern sector was marked stable. Halric lay in the cot, arm in brace, pelvis bound in a compression wrap, and stared at the ceiling's flickering light panel. A shadow shifted in the doorway. The Zalari officer from the briefing stepped in, eyes unreadable. "No one expected you to return. Neither did I," Halric said. "You should have died. Maybe next time." The Zalari tilted his head. "You said something when you reached the tower. Our sensors picked up a brief transmission. It wasn't in the logs." Halric closed his eyes, the painkillers finally kicking in with a slow warmth. "You thought that was my best." The Zalari watched him for a long moment, then turned and left, the door sealing behind him. Halric drifted into sleep, the silence around him broken only by the hum of machines and the distant sound of something being rebuilt.